Hi, and welcome to one of our online lectures here in World History. Today we're going to kick off our unit on ancient China. What we're going to look at is the geography and the culture. Whatever civilization we study, we always start with the geography. I always tell my students that to know who they are, we have to know where they are. Geography shapes us in a lot of different ways. So we're going to spend some time looking at some river systems, and we're going to look at the geography that really isolated the Chinese. Then we will look at the culture that develops in China and see in some ways how the geography shaped who they were. So that's our plan here today. You have one constructive response question. So those of you in my class, you should be writing this down on your notes packet. The question says this: describe China's geography and give examples as to how the Chinese adapted to it. So we're going to list several different geographic pieces in and around China, but the key to this is the second part of the question. It says, how did the Chinese adapt to it? So we're going to provide a couple of examples of how the Chinese culture changed due to the geography that they had available to them. And that's a pretty normal human thing. There's no perfect place on this planet. There's no perfect geographic location. So humans have been adapting to their geography since the dawn of humanity. Sometimes that's easier than others. In some places it's much more difficult. China's kind of a mix of both extremes. You're going to see some nice things about the geography of China and some difficult things. So the three things we're going to look at, like I said, we're going to start with the geography of China. Then we're going to mention some early dynasties. Now, if you've looked at your unit outcomes for this course, you know we're going to focus on several different dynasties. In this story, I'm going to tell you about the Xia, the Zhou, and the Shang dynasty, and they are not going to appear on your test. However, the reason I talk about them is they are the beginning. This would be like reading a book to somebody and skipping chapters 1, 2, and 3. It would make the rest of the story seem very incoherent. So we are going to mention these three dynasties as the beginning of this story. But we're just going to focus on several other dynasties as we move later on through this unit. So I just want you to know ahead of time that these three dynasties will not be on your test. And I will talk about them very, very briefly in today's story. The last thing we'll talk about is the development of Chinese culture, which of course is very unique and has some interesting features that are very, very unique to the Chinese. So we'll look at those things. All right, let's get right into it. Let's set the stage. China's first city walls were built 1,000 years after the walls of Ur, 1,000 years after the Great Pyramids, and certainly 1,000 years after the planned cities on the Indus rivers. Now, that's not to say that all three of those civilizations developed at the exact same time, but what I'm saying is the Chinese came later. The big difference here with China is they're still there. The Chinese people, ethnically speaking, are the same group that was there thousands of years ago. In fact, their culture is over 4,000 years old. The people in Egypt, they're gone. The people in Sumer, they're gone. The people in the Indus River Valley civilization, they're gone. But not the Chinese. Though they come just a little bit later than those other groups, they're still at it today. So ultimately, the Chinese will be the only civilization studied this semester that are still thriving in the same place today. And that's pretty cool. America's not even 300 years old yet, and the Chinese have been around for over 4,000 years. Do a little comparison there. What are we going to look like, 3,700 years from now? We're going to have our ups, we're going to have our downs, and China certainly did too, but they're still at it. They are still the Chinese. So when we look at geography, I like starting with this image. This is a satellite image of modern China, and you can definitely see some things going on here. For example, China is huge. It's this big right here, roughly about this size. You'll notice there's certainly a lot of desert, some highlands, a lot of mountain ranges, but there's also a lot of green too. That does not automatically translate into good farmland. What we're going to see is the bulk of the Chinese people in the ancient Chinese world and even today live right here. It's flatter, it's greener. This is a little bit more hilly and mountainous, and farming on the side of a mountain is difficult to do. So we're going to kind of look at all of this and see how the Chinese basically got locked right in here. That's going to make trade somewhat difficult. It's going to make invasion difficult. The Chinese have kind of been isolated because of their geography. So let's take a look. The geography of China. So natural barriers isolated ancient China. We just generalized that by looking at that satellite image. Now let's actually talk about some of these geographic pieces by name. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to sort of take like an east, west, north, south approach as we look at this region. So we'll start with the east. What you notice to the east of China was a lot of water. The Yellow Sea, the East China Sea, and the Pacific Ocean. This matters because in the ancient world, nobody had shipping technology that could cross an ocean. So big bodies of water such as these locked you in. Yes, you could hug the coastline and use the seas and the ocean for some basic travel, but crossing an ocean was impossible in the ancient world. That'll come much, much later. To the west, you had the Taklamakan Desert and the 15,000-foot plateau of Tibet. Those things are going to make it very difficult to travel and trade out west. To the southwest, you have the Himalayas. I mean, they're the largest mountain range in the world. You have Mount Everest in the Himalaya mountains. So no armies crossing that. No traders in the ancient world are crossing the Himalayas to go do business with other countries. So that helps lock you in as well. Then to the north, you had the Gobi Desert and the Mongolian Plateau. As with any desert, no one's going to cross that. An army's not going to cross it. Traders aren't going to cross it. And people aren't going to live there. So all of these items really kept the Chinese people in one spot for a long, long time. Only modern travel with airplanes and once road building gets better, will trade become a little bit easier with the Chinese. So here's what we're looking at, just another image, same idea. Most of the people live right in this area. We're going to talk about that in a little bit. It's really the land between the rivers. One of the next things I'm going to talk about is the river systems. But you kind of see this brown circle is just really where the bulk of the people would be. Two of the biggest cities in the world kind of bookend this, Beijing in the north and Shanghai here in the southern part of this region, really between these two rivers. There are billions of people that live here. I shouldn't say billions. They have over 1 billion people in China today, much bigger than the population of the U.S. You might say, well, there's green areas up here and down here, and I would say, yes, there are people there, but not in the same capacity as you see in this region here. So let's talk about those river systems. The unique thing about the rivers here is they have two names. We've talked about the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. We talked about the Nile in Egypt. We talked about the Indus and the Ganges River in India. But here in China, you have to remember two names for each of the rivers. So the first one we're going to talk about in the north is the Huang, also known as the Yellow River. And it gets its color because it deposits large amounts of yellowish silt called loess. That's what you see here. This sand is essentially what it is, gets blown into the river from nearby deserts. And because of its yellowish tint, you can kind of see the river sort of has a yellow color. The Chinese would have called it that, and so therefore it was known as the Yellow River. That silt is going to eventually be good for farmland, but it's, that's just an iconic feature of this river. So the Huang River is also known as the Yellow River. It's in the north. So if we look at this map, you can see it flows from the west over to the east here in the northern part of China. The second river we're going to look at is called the Changjiang, but it's also known as the Yangtze. So if you really want to try to remember the rivers in their most simplistic names, remember Y and Y, the Yellow and the Yangtze. Now, fair warning for my students, on your test at the end of this unit, I may put the names as the Changjiang and the Huang. I might put them as the Yellow and the Yangtze. So it does pay to know both names, but for simplistic purposes, I like to remember them as the Yellow and the Yangtze. So the Yangtze River flows east to the Yellow Sea, and at 3,988 miles long, it is the longest river in Asia. Of course, with these rivers, you want them to flood. There's some environmental challenges that come with that. If you have disastrous floods that can destroy homes and property and things like that. The Huang River, aka the Yellow River, has had some major flooding over its existence. And these are two modern pictures that show that. This image here on the right, man, you can see that town is going to have some serious flood damage here from the Yellow River. So flooding is something you want. Rivers need to flood in the ancient world to provide farmland, but they can also destroy a whole bunch of your cities. The other environmental challenge just about China in general is because they were so locked in due to their geography, it made trade very difficult. So trade was difficult. So the adaptation here is the settlers, the people that lived there, had to become self-dependent, meaning they had to live off of what they had. Again, there's no perfect place on this planet. There's no one place that has everything you need. You learn to basically make do with what you have. That is an adaptation. That's how the Chinese adapted to their geography, is being able to live without necessarily establishing elaborate trade networks. We can look at a geographic map. Only 10% of China's land is suitable for farming. Like, Sagan, that looks like a lot more than 10%. Well, you got to remember, a lot of this green stuff is on hillsides and mountains, and you really can't farm on hillsides and mountains, especially in the ancient world. So what that forces you to do, and here's another adaptation, is to live where the good farmland is, and that's exactly where this arrow is pointing. So most of the farmable land is on the North China Plain between the Yellow and the Yangtze River. So that's right here, this really, really dark green area. Again, here's two of the biggest cities in the world, Beijing and Shanghai. And so you're talking hundreds of millions of people live right here. So that is an adaptation as well. All right, that is where we are going to end part one. Part one, we focused on geography. In part two, we're going to focus on the culture that develops here in China. So go ahead and hit pause and queue up part two.